Today's Daf Yomi is Kiddushin Daf Samachas, Kiddushin 68. We're going to start on Samach Zayin Amud Beis 67b, 4 lines from the bottom. Today's Daf Yomi should be for Yeshua, Tzala, Anachama, and complete victory for all of Am Yisrael. May the captives be released at once. So we're going to start on 67b. And Samach Zayin Amud Beis, 4 lines from the bottom. So the Gemara had said in yesterday's daf that if there was a woman who she's able to be married to somebody else, but not to that man, then if she has relations with that man, it's going to result in a mamzer. That the Mishnah had said, Kol mi she'ein la alav Kiddushin, v'lo yesh la ala acherim Kiddushin. If she doesn't have Kiddushin with him, but she could have Kiddushin with other people, then the offspring is a mamzer. So Gemara says, what's the source for this idea? And yesterday's daf, the Gemara made a suggestion, but now we're going to take up with a new suggestion. It says, Amar Rabbi Yonah v'temer Rav Huna b'rei Rav Yoshua. It's based upon the fact that the pasuk says, Amar Kra, Kol asher yaseh mikol hatov vosa ela v'nichrasu. It says, whoever will do any of these abominations, and those souls will be cut off from the midst of your people. And since that pasuk was said with respect to a person who has relations with his wife's sister, all the rayos kulam, all the prohibited relations were compared to achos isha, to your wife's sister. Ma achos isha motavsi Kiddushin, just like your wife's sister, the Kiddushin does not take effect if you try to betroth her. So too, we learn this idea, and that's what we're trying. That's the source that we're looking for. How do we know that if there's a woman who you're not allowed to have Kiddushin with, it, the offspring is a mamzer, and the Kiddushin doesn't take effect with her? I've called rayas kulam lo tafsi lo Kiddushin. So too, if you have relations with this woman who you try to betroth her and you're not able, and it would be a mamzer, then the Kiddushin does not take effect. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, we're on top of Samachas Amud Aleph, Ihachi afilu nida nami. Let's say a person betrothed a woman and she was a nida, then the Kiddushin shouldn't take effect. And also, if he has relations with her when she's a nida, and the offspring would be a mamzer. Can you imagine if this was actually the halacha? This would be such a disaster for Klal Yisrael. There would be nobody able to do about teshuvah. And indeed, Rav Moshe Feinstein has often cited teshuvah about where they ask him, can you marry a person who's about tshuva because his mother never went to the mikvah? And we know that you're not supposed to, the Gemara says that you're not supposed to marry somebody whose mother didn't go to the mikvah. So Rav Moshe Feinstein gave a tshuva, said that we could assume that she went to the ocean and she went swimming, and therefore that's like the equivalent of the mikvah because she went with a type of garment where the water was able to go all over her body. But anyway, the Gemara now is asking, how do we know that maybe even if the person is in nida, then the Kiddushin shouldn't take effect? We paskin that it does, and also the offspring should be a mamzer. We paskin that it's not. So Alama Amar Abaye, why does Abaye say? So Abaye says, but we say that that's not the case, that if a person has relations with a nida or a sota woman, that the offspring is not a mamzer. But you just said that all the prohibited relationships are compared to your wife's sister. If that's the case, also a nida should be a mamzer. The offspring of a nida, a man who's with a nida, that should not take effect, and it should be a mamzer. So Amar Chizki, Amar Kra. Now there's a different pasuk that excludes a nida from this case. It says Vatahi nidas alav. It says in the pasuk Utahi nidas alav, which means afilush b'shas nidasa tahi ba'avaya, that even while she is a nida, then the Kiddushin will take effect. That because the word for Kiddushin in Torah is kiyeh. So therefore, tehei ba'avaya. So the Gemara says, well, we have one pasuk that tells us that by nida it does take effect. We have another pasuk that tells us that by achos isha it does not take effect, the Kiddushin. So why do we say that the controlling case is the achos isha? Why don't we say the controlling case is a nida, and that if you try to be mekadesh a woman who you're not allowed to be with, that it should take effect like a nida? Why are we comparing it to your wife's sister? We should compare it to Nida. Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Because we could be lenient, it could be strict. So we're deciding, since it's a case of an erva, we're deciding to be strict. And therefore, we say that the source for it is the achos isha, and therefore, hukshul all arise of the Torah compared to achos isha, that the Kiddushin doesn't take effect. So the Gemara says, Rav Acha bar Yaakov Amar, he gives a different explanation. He says, Asya, how are we going to learn? Rashi says, all other prohibitions. We're not going to learn it from the achos isha, because indeed we have that case that why compare to achos isha when we compare it to nida? So he's going to give us a different logic. What's his logic? Rav Acha bar Yaakov says, Asya, and look at Rashi, we learn out Sha'arayos b'kavachomer from a yavam l'shuk, from a woman who falls to yibam, and then a man has relations with her. Now, what do we say there? Rashi says, She'en Kiddushin Tobsim Ba. We learn from a Kavachomer, from a Yavam L'Shuk, where if a person tries to betroth her before she had Yibam or Chalitza, that we're going to say that under those circumstances, Rashi says, She'en Kiddushin Tobsim Ba. The Kiddushin doesn't take effect. Like Rav taught in Yavamos, Minayin She'en Kiddushin Tobsim Ba Yavama, D'chsev Lo Siyah Eishes Hamei Sachutza, means to say that there's no Kiddushin, the Kiddushin can't take effect with her. So therefore, he says, Asya b'kal chomer mi Yavama, ma Yavama shehi b'lav, just like Yavama, which is just a regular prohibition, and if a man wants to be with her while she's still waiting for Yibam or Chalitza, lo tafsi b'al Kiddushin, the Kiddushin doesn't take effect. Chayve misos or chayve krisos, if you have a more severe prohibition, which is a penalty of death or kares l'kol came for sure, the Kiddushin couldn't take effect. Gemara says, well, if that's the case, well, why don't we learn from Yibam? Why don't we learn from Yibam that all other prohibitions, just regular prohibitions, the Kiddushin should also not take effect? Look at Rashi. Rashi says, but okay, we can't prove a Kavachomer from Yavam L'Shuk, but we can do a comparison by all other prohibitions that it should also be the Kiddushin shouldn't take effect. Just a regular prohibition. I'm a Rav Papa. No, Rav Papa says the regular prohibition that the Kiddushin would take effect. It's just a regular prohibition that we learn out from the pasuk. It says Ki sienu la'ish shtei nashim. If a man will have two wives, ahachas ahova, one who is loved, ahachas sinua, and one who is hated. And then the Gemara interrupts. Does God hate one or love one? How is that possible? El ahuva means, when it says that one wife is loved, it means ahuva b'nisuah. It means she's loved with her, meaning it's a kosher marriage. And when it says sinua, when it says it's hated, it means sinua b'nisuah, that she's hated in marriage. It means to say it's prohibited. Like, for example, a regular prohibition. So therefore, v'ka'amar rachmana kisiena, and the pasuk says kisiena, which means that the marriage takes effect. So therefore, we see if it's a regular prohibition, the marriage takes effect. Or Rabbi Akiva da Amar. So that's the proof for this idea that only Yavam L'Shuk does the Kiddushin not take effect. By all other lavin, it does take effect. Nor says, but wait 1 second. But there is a position of Rabbi Akiva who says that all chayve lavin, but it's just a regular prohibition. Rabbi Akiva is very strict. He says, Rabbi Akiva Damar ain't Kiddushin Tovasim L'chayve lavin. He says by a regular prohibition, the Kiddushin does not take effect. So if that's the case, what does Rabbi Akiva do with this pasuk of Kisiena, of Kisieno Ishtei Nashim? How does he understand this idea? Because the pasuk we understood it to mean that the Kiddushin takes effect by Chayve lavin. So what does Rabbi Akiva do that? So Rabbi Akiva says Kisiena b'may mukumla b'almana l'kohen gadol, and this is something we had yesterday's daf and the day before. Rabbi Akiva says that refers to a case of a widow to a kohen gadol. In that case, the Kiddushin does take effect, because there the Torah says specifically that the offspring is not a mamzer but a halal. Rabbi Simai Titania, and this accords with the brisa that Rabbi Simai taught. Titania Rabbi Simai Omer Menakoya Rabbi Akiva Usa Mamzer. Rabbi Akiva said from every case, every prohibition, even a nida, Rabbi Akiva would say that the offspring is a mamzer, or if a person marries, a kohen marries a grusha, Chutz mi'almana lekohen gadol, with the exception of a widow to a kohen gadol. That's the only prohibition which Rabbi Akiva says does not create a mamzer, and that except in the case of a widow to a kohen gadol. Sha'arei amar Torah lo yechalel chilulim. The Torah says lo yechalel, that you should not, that a widow to a kohen gadol makes a halal. Chilulim oseh ve'ein oseh mamzeres. That Rabbi Akiva is saying that in that case, the case of a widow to a kohen gadol, it makes a halal and not a mamzer. But all other cases of a regular prohibition, it does create a mamzer. Gemara says, well, Rabbi Yeshivav, you know that Rabbi Yeshivav was one of the Asarei Arugei Malchus, so we know him from Yom Kippur. Rabbi Yeshivav was one of the 10 martyrs, and he said, Bovin Etzavecha Akiva ben Yosef, come and scream out at Rabbi Akiva ben Yosef. That's the third time that we have somebody shouting in our Masechta. He says, let's yell at Rabbi Akiva. So, according to Rabbi Yeshivav, who says that he was saying, let's scream at Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva said anybody who has a non-kosher relations, it creates a mamzer, according to Rabbi Akiva. Meaning, say, even a widow to a kohen gadol. Rabbi Yeshivav says, Rabbi Akiva says everything is a mamzer. He says, let's scream at Rabbi Akiva. He doesn't even call him Rabbi Akiva. He calls him Akiva ben Yosef. He's so upset at him. He's saying, you're making all the Jewish children into mamzerim, because anybody who's not religious, basically, you're making them a mamzer. They didn't go to the mikveh, you're making them a mamzer. So he says, let's scream at him, because he's making all these mamzerim. So what's he going to do with that pasuk of Kisieno Ishtein Hashem? He says, now, Hanicho Rabbi Yeshivav, it makes sense according to Rabbi Yeshivav. Rabbi Simaikasi Shapir. If Rabbi Yeshivav is just coming to tell us that Rabbi Simai is wrong, and he's saying that Rabbi Akiva is saying by all prohibitions, by all chavei laivin, including widow to a kohen gadol, that's a mamzer. Well, that makes sense. And then he could say that where Rabbi Yeshiva would say that when it says kisiena, according to Rabbi Akiva, it's coming to say that if you're with an Egyptian or that if you're with an Egyptian or an Edomite, which is a chai ve'asei, then Rabbi Akiva says that in that case, you're not a that the Kiddushin takes effect, but by Chai Ve'Lavin it doesn't take effect. Meaning, say even by Almanah to Kohen Gadol it doesn't take effect. Ella time in the Nafshi Kamer. But if Rabbi Yeshivav is not saying just to say that Rabbi Simai is wrong, but he's saying that this is what Rabbi Akiva says in general, meaning to say, he's saying that any time where there's a bia that is not allowed, Rabbi Akiva says it's a mamzer. Meaning to say, even in a case of an asay, well, if that like a mitzri and adomi, so if that's the case, what does Rabbi Akiva do with that pasuk of kisieno eshtein Hashem? Where do you have a case where there's a relationship that results in a kedushin, and yet at the same time, Rabbi Akiva says it's not, and yet it's a prohibited relationship, according to Rabbi Akiva. So, Rabbi Simai, you hear those planes? They're from our team. Don't worry. We'll just wait for the planes to cross. The planes are from our team, as President Biden said. So, but if Rabbi Yeshivav is saying his own logic, his own reasoning, and he's saying he's saying that according to Rabbi Akiva, even if it's a prohibition by a positive commandment, i.e., being with an Egyptian or an Edomite, that it's still going to be prohibited, that it's still going to create a mamzer b'may mukim law. So according to that case, what does Rabbi Akiva say? Is this pasuk of Kisiano Eshtein Hashem? Where does Rabbi Akiva say it's a valid betrothal, even though it results in a woman who is snuel if they are makom, who is it's not appropriate, it's hated before God. So the Gemara says, he says bibu'ul a kohen gadol. He says it's not a case of a widow to a kohen gadol. He's going to say it's somebody who is a non-virgin who is with the kohen gadol, which Rashi reminds us is also a positive commandment that the kohen has to marry a besua, virgin, because it says isha b'bsua yukach. She needs to marry a besua and not somebody who's beula. And so if that's the case, that's what Rabbi Akiva says it's referring to. That the offspring of that is of that. That's what we're going to say, that's a valid kiddushin, even though it's prohibited, and it does not create a mamzer. So the Gemara says, well, if that's the case, why is that different from an almana to kohen gadol, or the widow to a kohen gadol, which Rabbi Akiva says creates a mamzer, but a be'ua to a kohen gadol does not? because this is something that it's what's called. Why is this different than the case of the asay from an Egyptian and an Edomite? Why is the case of a Bu'ua different from that? They're both asays. So he says, because this case is the reason why it doesn't create a mamzer, according to Rabbi Kiva, is because it's asay she'enu shavel b'kol. It only applies to the Kohen Gadol. It's a positive commandment, only applies to the Kohen Gadol, and so therefore it does not create a mamzer. So that's Rabbi Akiva's logic, according to Rabbi Yeshav. So the Rabbanon, and according to the Rabbanon, who said that this idea of, according to the Rabbanon, who say that everything is going to be, we're going to learn out from Achos Isha, that all the arayos create, that all the arayos create mamzerim except for nida. So the Gemara says, Rabbanon adimukule b'chai ve'lavin, nukmi b'chai ve'aseh. According to the Rabbanon, look at Rashi. According to Rabbanon, who say who say that this case of kisiena ishtain hashim, that it creates, that all these cases, that it's just a chai ve'lav, it's just a regular prohibition, the Kiddushin takes effect, and the offspring is not a mamzer. Why do they say that pasuk refers to a regular prohibition? Why don't we say that it just refers to a positive prohibition, a positive commandment? That's what Rashi says. Because we could have learned it out by comparing it by Avama Mashuk. So why did the Rabbanon not say that it's by a positive commandment? So the Gemara answers, Hani chayve asay b'mayninu. The Gemara says, what would be the chayve asay that this pasuk could be referring to? What could be the positive commandment that it could possibly be referring to? Ishtei and mitrios. If it would be referring to two Egyptian women, then they would both be shtei and snuos. If they would both be hated and both be prohibited. If it would be, one would be an Egyptian and one would be a regular Jewish woman, the pasuk says shtei nashim, so then part that they're both from the same nation. And Kohen Gadol, and if it will be referring to one who's not a Besua, but who's a Be'ua to a Kohen Gadol, it doesn't say that it's only referring to a pasuk. So we need to say two women who are in a similar category, and so therefore it's not logical to assume like Rabbi Yeshivav or Rabbi Akiva. Where it says Rabbi Akiva, Bal Korchach Shavke Lekra Dahave Dachek Muki Anafshe, and Rabbi Akiva says we have no choice. Shavke Lekra that the pasuk is dachik, and we need to interpret it this way. Look at Rashi. Given the Yavama, the Tafsibo Kiddushin, since the pasuk told us by Yavama that the Kiddushin doesn't take effect by Yavama or Shuk, Ne'ov Minei, we have to learn out from there the Chayve Lavin Leisbu Kiddushin, that if it is irregular prohibition, there's no Kiddushin. And so therefore, the pasuk of Kisiena, therefore we have no choice but to read it as referring to positive commandments. And we have to do it like go Nechada Mitzvah, and it refers to where one of them was an Egyptian, that's like Rabbi Simai, or Rabbi Yeshiva. We have no choice, says Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so now we're on, and now the next line of the Mishnah. The next line of the Mishnah says, Kol mi she'ein la olav Kiddushin. Anybody who does not have Kiddushin with her, but Kol mi she'ein la olav Kiddushin, but there is Kiddushin with other people, then the offspring is going to be a mamzer. So, and then the next line of the Mishnah after that says, Kol mi she'ein la olav v'lo acherim. Anybody who does not have Kiddushin, not with him or not with others, then we're going to say under that circumstances, the offspring is like her. Avlad Kamosa, the offspring is like the mother. And what's that referring to? This refers to the offspring of a Shifcha and a Nachris. So Gemara says, okay, so how do we know Shifcha Canaanis? We know, and how do we know that if the woman is a Canaanite slave and a man is with her, how do we know that the Kiddushin doesn't take effect? How do we know if you try to marry a Shifcha Canaanis, the Kiddushin doesn't take effect? Amar Afuna, Amar Kra, Pasuk says, Shvuachem poem achamor, that Avram says at the Akedah, remain here with the donkey, which means to say Amadom achamor, that the Canaanites is like a nation similar to a donkey, meaning to say that it doesn't take effect. Just like you can't marry a donkey, you can't marry a Canaanite. Where it says Ashkechan delo tafsi bakidushe. Okay, fine. We know from here, we're on top of Samabez. We know from here that you can't make that the Kiddushin doesn't take effect with her. Vlada kamosa mino, and how do we know that? How do we know that the offspring is like her? So the Gemara says, The Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "Isha viladea tiyel adonai," that the woman and her offspring will be Aisha viladea tiyel adonai. That in the case of a man who marries a shifcha kananis, that this is talking about a case of a shifcha kananis who was designated for an eved ivri, and the pasuk says that the offspring of that eved ivri with a shifcha kananis, the slave does not go free. That offspring remains a Canaanite slave, like the mother. And the Gemara says, Nachris minon. Okay, that's the case of a shifcha kananis. How do we know that the Kiddushin doesn't take effect if she's not a slave? She's just a regular Canaanite. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, bam. We see from here the pasuk says that you're not allowed to betroth them. That's by a Canaanite slave, meaning to say, by a regular Canaanite. The pasuk says, I was just reading the Tosfos there on the side very very quickly, but it says that we see from the pasuk, it says you're not allowed to marry them. The lotavsi bo kedushin, that the kedushin does not take effect. So let me just read the Torah. So Spirish Bekuntras, the Rashi is explaining Lo Yichal Bahem Torah's Chatnus, that the Torah, that the laws of marriage don't take effect with the Canaanites, but with the idolaters, excuse me. But then Tosfos says something that's very, very controversial, which means he says this is difficult. Shari Hai Kro Mary Ba'uvdei Kochavim. This verse does not refer to idolaters. It doesn't refer to an idolater. This verse is only telling us you're not allowed to marry the 7 nations. It doesn't tell us you're not allowed to marry anybody who's not from the 7 nations. It doesn't tell us you're not allowed to marry somebody who's not from the 7 nations of the world, as it states in Paraka Aral. So therefore, anyway, Tosfos goes on. I want to get into Tosfos, but that's why Rav Moshe of Kusi, the Smag, is saying that maybe it's not a biblical prohibition to marry somebody who's not from the 7 nations. But anyway, that's a very controversial idea, so we're not going to get into that. So it's also minority opinion. So Gemara says, Kedushin. So we learn from here that the Kiddushin doesn't take effect with a woman who's not of the Jewish faith. But Vlada Kamosa Minon, how do we know that her offspring is considered to be not Jewish? Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon ben Chai, Damar Kra, it's based upon the pasuk. It says, Ki asir es bincha me'acharai. That if you take your children and you remove them from away from me. Bincha ba mi'Yisrael is karoi bincha. This teaches us that your son, who is born from a Jewish woman, is called your son. Ve'en bincha ba min avodas kochavim karoi bincha el binah. But if your son is born from an idolater, it's not called your son, but it's called her son. Rashi says we learn this out from the fact that it doesn't as midiloksiv nami kitasir is bincha. From the fact that it doesn't say when you remove your. I'm sorry. You remove your son. Dinishma minay the carpet nami krababito otikacha bencha mishum kitasir sabena nolad la bincha alma bena over this kochavim ina korah bencha ela benah. So the son of the idolatrous woman is not called your son, but her son. So now we go to the next pasuk, the next line. Amar Ravina shma mina. We learn from here ben bitcha bamen ovi kochavim. The son of your daughter who came from an idolatry, karoi bencha, is called your son. If it's your grandson, and the male idolater was with your daughter, that offspring is going to be called your son. Name a kasavar avina. Maybe so. Can we learn from here the ravinas of the position? Ovik chavim ve'eved abal bas Yisrael avlan mamzer. So should we learn from here that ravinas are the position that idolater or a slave who is with a Jewish girl, that the offspring will be considered a mamzer? Gemara says no. Nihi de kasher lo have mamzer lo have, but pasal mikri. So the Gemara says, well, okay, so maybe it's not kosher and it's not a mamzer, but at least we should call it pasal. Gemara says no. Ahu b'shiva gayim ksiv. Okay, but that pasuk is only with respect to the 7 nations. Shar umos minon. How do we know that this also applies to all the other nations? Amar Kraki Asir Espincha says when you will remove your son, L'Rabos Ko Amasirim. That means to include anybody who removes L'Rabos Ko Amasirim, anybody who is not from the Jewish faith. This halacha applies to. The Gemara says Well, Hanichol Rabbi Shimon, that only works according to Rabbi Shimon, who we've seen throughout Shas. Rabbi Shimon's position is that he's Dorish time of the Krah. We saw Rabbi Shimon said this back in Kiddushin on Chafaf. We saw he said it in Gittin and Sota that this was the position of Rabbi Shimon. Then he says you can go down to what the pasuk is about, meaning say even though it's not explicit, you could see the time of the Krah, the meaning of the verses. Our Rabbanan my time. How do the Rabbanan say know that this applies not only to the Shiva Samamid? It says Amarkar, it's based upon the fact that the pasuk says V'achar kain tavo elel v'altah. And afterwards, after this by H.S.C. Fastoa, that after you convert her, you come together with her and have relations. We call the Mikaro Tafsibo Kedushin. Means originally the Kedushin wouldn't have taken effect with this woman before she converted. Gemara says Ashkan Lo Tafsibo Kedushin. Okay, we see from here that the Kedushin doesn't take effect. But Vada Kamosa Mino, and how do we know that the offspring is like her? Amarkra Kisieno Ish. It says when you be with a man, the Yolduo, and they'll give birth to him. Kohecha de Karina Bay Kisiena. Anytime where it says Kisiena, Karina Bay Yolduo. Anytime where it's a valid betrothal, then we say that it's his offspring. But if it's not a valid betrothal, Kohecha de Lo Karina Bay Kisiena, Lo Karina Bay Yolduo. Anytime where it's not a valid betrothal, it's not called his children. Yachi Shifcha Nami. Well, if that's the case by a Shifcha Nami, that in the case of a slave woman where the offspring is like her, why don't we learn out from this pasuk also that it's not going to be considered his child? But why do we have to learn out from what we said on the Amud Aleph, which is Amadom Lechamor? Why don't we just learn out from this pasuk? Where it says inachinami. So fine, that's correct. We can also learn out a shifcha from here. So if that's the case, so if that's the case, why do we need the pasuk that tells us that if you're with a shifcha kananis, the Eved Ivri, that the offspring will belong to the master and it doesn't go with you? Why do we need that pasuk? Tanya Omer was shifcha, so it's like the following brayse. Torn on top of Samach Tesam and Alf. Person says to a shifcha, Harei bat chorin, that uvadecha. If somebody says to a shifcha who's pregnant, he gives her a get shich, or he gives her a document of emancipation, and he says with this get, with this document of emancipation, you're free, uvadecha evid, and your offspring will be a slave. Vuada kamosa, that we say under those circumstances that this pasuk is teaching us that the offspring will be free. You don't have the ability, if the mother is free, you don't have the ability to say that the offspring will be a slave. That's the position of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. The Chachamim Dvarav Kayamim, but the Chachamim say we learn from this pasuk, no, that he's able to do that. As it says, Aishavi Wadeh Tiyala Adonai, because it says Aishavi Wadeh Tiyala Adonai. Maitam. So, I'm sorry.
I mean, the entire get like she would also be to.
No, the get shikhr would be valid, but the offspring would remain in Eved. That's what the Chachamim are saying. Dvarav Kayamim, his words remain effect. And that's teaching us that the offspring remains a slave. And the Gemara says, well, how do we learn that out, that his words will take effect? I assume that that's what it means, that the woman is freed, it's the get shikhr, but the offspring, the fetus, remains a slave. And how do we learn that from this pasuk? Amarava ad Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that this pasuk is referring back to what Rabbi Yossi Aglili said, V'ada kamoah, that the offspring is like her because it says, Isha v'ladea tiyah adonah. So that's how they learn it out. So Rashi says, okay, so let me stop the recording here. This is the Daf Yomi. Shkoyach to everybody.